For thousands of years, people believed green eyes were a mark of witches, sorcery, even a curse. Old European folklore warned that a green-eyed stranger could bring bad luck into your home. In some villages, green eyes were seen as proof of a hidden bloodline with the Fae, something not quite human. But science just proved something far stranger than any of those old stories. Green eyes shouldn't exist at all. Every single human who ever lived, for more than 190,000 years, had one eye color, and only one. Then something broke, quietly deep inside our DNA, and what happened next has forced scientists to rewrite what they thought they understood about human evolution itself. Right now, take a moment and think about how many green-eyed people you actually know. Chances are you can count them on one hand. Maybe you can't think of a single one. That's not a coincidence, and it's not just because you live somewhere green eyes happen to be uncommon. It's because green is, without question, the rarest naturally occurring eye color on the planet. Out of every 100 people alive today, only about 2 of them have green eyes. Compare that to brown eyes, which cover roughly 79% of humanity, or blue eyes, which sit somewhere between 8 and 10%. Green eyes are the outlier, the anomaly, the genetic long shot that somehow, against enormous odds, keeps showing up in delivery rooms around the world. To understand why that is so strange, we have to go back, not just a few centuries, but tens of thousands of years, to a time when the concept of a green-eyed human being simply did not exist anywhere on Earth. For the overwhelming majority of our species, it was universal. If you could travel back 100,000 years and look into the eyes of any human on the planet, you would see the same thing every single time. Deep, dark brown, packed with melanin, the same as almost every other mammal on Earth. Then, something changed. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, give or take, a mutation appeared. Not a dramatic sweeping change across the entire species, but something small. A tiny, almost invisible alteration in a strand of DNA belonging to a single individual, somewhere near what is now the Black Sea region. Scientists believe this person, this one single ancestor, carried the first version of a genetic switch that would eventually give rise to every blue and green-eyed person alive today. That means, in the most literal sense possible, that if you have blue or green eyes right now, you can trace that trait back to one shared ancestor, one person, one mutation, spreading outward through generation after generation until it reached you. That sounds almost too strange to be true, but this is where real genetics research comes in, and it is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. In 2008, a landmark study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics identified the exact genetic switch responsible for this shift. Researchers pinpointed a single variant, a solitary letter of DNA, hidden inside a gene called HERC2. This variant sits in what's known as intron 86, a region that doesn't directly build proteins itself, but instead acts like a dimmer switch for a neighboring gene. That neighboring gene is called OCA2, and it plays one of the most important roles in determining how much pigment your iris produces. Here's where it gets interesting. HERC2 doesn't create eye color on its own. Instead, it controls how active OCA2 is allowed to be. Think of OCA2 as a factory that produces melanin, the pigment responsible for darkening your eyes, skin, and hair. HERC2 acts like the manager standing at the factory door, deciding how much raw material gets sent inside and how hard that factory is allowed to work. When HERC2 is functioning at full strength, OCA2 produces plenty of melanin, and the result is a deep brown eye. But that single mutation near the Black Sea altered HERC2 just enough to partially shut that factory down. Less signal reaches OCA2, less melanin gets produced, and the iris ends up lighter as a result. Now here's the detail almost nobody expects. Blue eyes are not actually blue. There is no blue pigment anywhere in the human eye. What's really happening is a lack of pigment combined with a physics trick called Rayleigh scattering, the exact same phenomenon that makes the sky appear blue instead of black. So if blue eyes come from very low melanin and brown eyes come from very high melanin, it would be reasonable to assume green eyes sit exactly in the middle. A little pigment, a little scattering, and you land somewhere between the two extremes. But that assumption turns out to be wrong, and this is one of the more surprising findings to come out of recent eye color research. Green eyes are not simply a midpoint between brown and blue. They are their own distinct genetic outcome, created by a very specific and much less common combination of variants across both HERC2 and OCA2, working together in a particular way that doesn't happen nearly as often as the mutations leading to blue or brown. A 2011 study published in the journal Human Genetics dug deeper into this relationship and confirmed that OCA2 and HERC2, working together, form the primary genetic architecture behind eye color as a whole. But the researchers found something else that changed how scientists thought about this trait entirely. The derived alleles responsible for lighter eye colors showed clear signs of positive selection. In plain language, that means these light eye color variants weren't just randomly drifting through the population by chance the way many neutral mutations do. Something was actively favoring them. Nature, in some way, was choosing to keep them around and spread them further. That single finding raises an enormous question. If brown eyes worked perfectly fine for our species for hundreds of thousands of years, protecting the eye from intense ultraviolet light and offering no apparent downside, why would evolution favor a mutation that reduces that protection? Why would a population begin selecting for eyes with less melanin, less UV defense, and, as some research suggests, potentially higher sensitivity to certain light-related risks? This is where evolutionary biologists have proposed a handful of competing theories, and none of them are fully settled science yet. One leading theory centers on geography and sunlight itself. As early humans migrated northward out of Africa and into regions like northern and eastern Europe, they encountered dramatically less direct sunlight than their ancestors had in equatorial regions. Skin, hair, and eye pigmentation all began shifting in response to that lower UV environment. Less intense sunlight meant less need for heavy melanin protection, and populations in these regions gradually developed lighter skin, lighter hair, and lighter eyes, as the genetic pressure to maintain dark pigmentation eased. Under this theory, green and blue eyes weren't specifically selected for their own sake. They were simply a byproduct of a broader genetic shift toward lower pigmentation overall, something that happened to affect the iris right along with the skin. A second theory is far more provocative and considerably harder to prove. Some researchers have proposed that eye color, much like hair color, may have played a role in mate selection among early human populations. In small, relatively isolated communities, a rare and visually distinctive trait like a light-colored eye might have stood out, making an individual more noticeable or more memorable to potential partners. If that novelty translated into even a slightly higher chance of reproducing, the trait could spread through a population surprisingly fast, even if it offered no direct survival advantage on its own. This idea, often referred to broadly as sexual selection, remains debated among scientists, and there is no definitive genetic proof confirming it drove the spread of green or blue eyes specifically. But it remains one of the more compelling explanations for why a trait with seemingly no survival benefit managed to persist and even expand within certain populations. Regardless of which theory eventually gains the most support, the genetic outcome is clear. Somewhere along that migration northward, in the same broad region where scientists believe the original HERC2 mutation first appeared, the specific combination of variants responsible for green eyes emerged and slowly took hold. This helps explain a pattern researchers have observed again and again. Green eyes appear far more frequently in populations with roots in northern and central Europe than almost anywhere else in the world. Countries around the Baltic region and parts of Scandinavia report noticeably higher rates of green-eyed individuals compared to the global average, while in large parts of Asia and Africa, green eyes remain exceptionally rare, sometimes appearing in less than 1 out of every 1,000 people. That geographic pattern connects directly back to the biology itself. Remember, green eyes require a very particular, moderate level of melanin, not the near total absence you find with blue eyes, and not the dense saturation found in brown eyes, but something in between, paired with a very specific structural arrangement inside the iris. Researchers describe this as a moderate number of melanin-storing structures called melanosomes, present in a moderate concentration, combined with the same Rayleigh scattering effect responsible for blue eyes. That scattered blue light then mixes with a small amount of actual brownish-yellow pigment called lipochrome, and the combination of the two creates that hazel green hue people recognize instantly, often shifting slightly depending on lighting, clothing color, or even mood, since the perceived shade can change with how light interacts with the iris surface. This is also why green eyes are famous for appearing to change color throughout the day. Someone with green eyes might look distinctly green in natural daylight, then appear closer to hazel or gray under fluorescent indoor lighting, and shift again entirely under warm evening light. This isn't your imagination, and it isn't inconsistency in how the eye was described. It's a direct consequence of how thin the pigment layer really is. With brown eyes, there's so much dense melanin that lighting conditions barely change the overall appearance. But with green eyes, the pigment is subtle enough that ambient light plays a much larger role in what an observer actually perceives, which is part of why green eyes have earned a reputation across cultures for feeling almost hypnotic or ever-changing. Now, here's where the actual inheritance mechanics come into play, and this is often the part people find the most surprising. For a long time, eye color was taught in basic biology classes, using an extremely simplified model, one where brown was treated as a simple dominant trait and blue as a simple recessive trait, as if a single gene controlled the entire outcome. That model made for an easy classroom lesson, but it turns out to be far too simple to reflect what's really happening in human DNA. Eye color is a polygenic trait, meaning multiple genes contribute to the final result, not just one. Researchers have now identified more than 150 different genes that appear to influence eye color to varying degrees, some playing a major role like OCA2 and HERC2, and many others contributing smaller, more subtle effects. Because of that complexity, two brown-eyed parents can, in rare cases, have a green-eyed or even a blue-eyed child, something the old simplified dominant recessive model could never fully explain. Each parent might be carrying hidden, non-expressed variants inherited from earlier generations, variants that don't show up in their own eye color but can combine unexpectedly in their children. This is part of the reason eye color has fascinated geneticists for so long. It looks simple on the surface, something you can literally see just by looking at someone's face, yet the underlying mechanism is remarkably intricate, shaped by dozens of interacting genes rather than one clean, predictable rule. It's worth pausing here to talk about hazel eyes too, because people confuse hazel and green constantly, and the genetics actually explain why that confusion happens so often. Hazel eyes sit on a kind of spectrum right next to green, sharing many of the same underlying variants in OCA2 and HERC2, but with a slightly different balance of pigment and a more pronounced ring or burst pattern radiating outward from the pupil. In some people, the line between hazel and green isn't a hard boundary at all, it's a gradient, and where an individual eye falls on that gradient can depend on subtle differences in melanin. Distribution that even researchers sometimes struggle to categorize with total precision. A 2019 study looking at large twin cohorts found a genuine continuum running from pure green through green with brown flecks, all the way to eyes that are almost entirely brown except for a thin green ring near the outer edge. That continuum tells us something important. Eye color was never meant to fit neatly into 5 or 6 labeled categories the way a paint chart at a hardware store does. It's a biological gradient, and the words we use to describe it, blue, green, hazel, brown, are really just convenient shorthand for a much smoother, messier underlying reality. Twin studies have actually been one of the most valuable tools scientists have used to untangle how much of eye color comes down to genetics versus other factors. Identical twins, who share essentially the same DNA, overwhelmingly show matching or near matching eye colors, which strongly reinforces just how heritable this trait really is. But researchers have also documented rare cases where identical twins show slightly different eye color intensity or shade, something that hints at subtle environmental or developmental factors playing a small supporting role alongside the dominant genetic script. These cases are uncommon, but they remind us that even a trait as strongly genetic as eye color isn't purely mechanical. There's still a small margin where biology allows for variation, even between two people who are genetically almost identical. Another gene worth mentioning is MC1R, a gene most people associate with red hair and fair skin rather than eye color. But researchers have found that certain variants of MC1R appear more frequently in people with green eyes than would be expected by chance alone. This doesn't mean MC1R directly creates green eyes the way HERC2 and OCA2 do. Instead, it appears to interact with the broader pigmentation network in a way that nudges the odds slightly, which may help explain why green eyes, red hair, freckles, and fair skin so often show up together in the same individuals or the same families. None of these traits cause one another directly. They're more like genetic neighbors, frequently inherited as a package, because the underlying variants tend to travel together through certain populations, particularly those with roots in Northern and Western Europe and the British Isles. There's another detail that tends to surprise people once they learn it. Green eyes appear to hold their intensity differently as people age compared to other eye colors. Many babies are born with eyes that appear blue or gray at birth, regardless of what their eventual adult eye color will be, because melanin production in the iris hasn't fully developed yet at the time of birth. Over the first 1 to 3 years of life, melanin gradually builds up, and the true eye color begins to emerge and stabilize. Eyes that will end up brown tend to darken fastest and most dramatically, while eyes destined to be blue often barely change at all. Green eyes tend to fall somewhere in between during this developmental window, often taking a bit longer to fully settle into their final shade compared to brown eyes. Beyond the genetics itself, this rare eye color has developed something close to a cultural mythology of its own. Across countless cultures, green eyes have been associated with mystery, magic, unpredictability, and sometimes even danger. In parts of medieval Europe, green eyes were viewed with suspicion, occasionally linked to accusations of witchcraft during periods of intense superstition. In other traditions, particularly across parts of the Middle East and South Asia, green eyes were considered a sign of extraordinary beauty, rarity, and even good fortune, something almost otherworldly in a population where dark eyes overwhelmingly dominate. Literature has leaned into this fascination for centuries, repeatedly using green eyes as shorthand for characters who are enigmatic, seductive, or somehow set apart from everyone around them. None of that cultural symbolism has any real basis in biology, of course. Having green eyes doesn't influence someone's personality, their intelligence, or their fate in any measurable scientific sense, but the sheer rarity of the trait, combined with how visually striking it can be, especially the way it seems to shift and shimmer under different lighting, has clearly left a lasting impression on human storytelling across almost every culture that has encountered it. It's also worth addressing a question that comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed, which is whether green eyes can actually change color over the course of someone's life beyond just the lighting effects we already talked about. The honest answer is nuanced. The core underlying pigment level established in early childhood generally stays fairly stable for most of adulthood. You're not going to wake up one day with a fundamentally different eye color than the one you had at 25. However, subtle shifts have been documented in some individuals over longer timescales, particularly related to hormonal changes, certain medications, and in rare cases, specific eye conditions that affect melanin production later in life. Pregnancy has been anecdotally linked to slight shifts in perceived eye shade in some women, likely tied to hormonal fluctuations, though this remains an area with fairly limited formal research. Age itself can also play a role, with some people noticing their eyes appear to lighten slightly as they get older, a phenomenon some researchers attribute to gradual changes in the density and arrangement of iris tissue over decades, rather than an actual shift in melanin quantity. None of these changes are dramatic, and none of them turn a genuinely brown-eyed person green, but they do explain why some people swear their eyes looked different in their 20s compared to now, and it isn't necessarily just a trick of memory. There's also a broader evolutionary puzzle here that scientists haven't fully closed the book on yet, and it connects back to that positive selection finding from the 2011 human genetics study. If a trait offers no clear survival advantage and might even carry a slight disadvantage through reduced UV protection, evolutionary theory generally predicts that trait should either stay rare through simple genetic drift or gradually disappear over enough generations, especially in a species with a reproductive timeline as long as ours. Yet green and blue eyes didn't just survive. In parts of Northern Europe, they became remarkably common, in some regions appearing in a genuinely large share of the population rather than staying as a rare curiosity. That pattern is exactly what leads researchers back toward selection, based explanations rather than pure chance. Something, whether it was mate preference, some subtle regional advantage we haven't fully identified yet, or a combination of multiple pressures working together, pushed this trait forward, rather than letting it fade into obscurity the way most neutral mutations eventually do over tens of thousands of years. One particularly interesting angle researchers have explored involves vitamin D synthesis and overall pigmentation strategy in low sunlight environments. As human populations spread into higher latitudes with weaker, more seasonal sunlight, there was significant evolutionary pressure toward lighter skin, since lighter skin allows more efficient vitamin D production under reduced UV exposure, which was critical for bone health and overall survival in these environments. Because skin, hair, and eye pigmentation are all governed by overlapping genetic pathways involving melanin production, some researchers believe the shift toward lighter eyes may have essentially hitchhiked alongside this broader, more directly advantageous shift toward lighter skin. Under this framework, evolution wasn't necessarily selecting for green or blue eyes specifically. It was selecting for an entire lighter pigmentation profile as an adaptation to a low sunlight environment. And eye color simply came along for the ride as part of that larger genetic package. This remains an active area of research, and most serious geneticists studying this topic today would tell you the full picture likely involves a combination of several of these theories working together, rather than one single explanation accounting for everything we observe. It's also worth taking a moment to talk about how modern genetic testing has changed our understanding of all this. A couple of decades ago, most of what scientists knew about eye color inheritance came from large-scale family studies, tracking eye color across parents, children, and grandchildren, and building statistical models based on those patterns. Today, direct DNA sequencing allows researchers to look straight at the actual variants present in an individual's HERC2 and OCA2 genes, along with dozens of other contributing genes, and generate genuinely predictive models of eye color with a fairly high degree of accuracy. Some consumer genetic testing services now offer eye color prediction as part of their standard reports, built on exactly this kind of research. These predictions aren't perfect because of just how many genes are involved and how they interact in subtle, sometimes unpredictable ways. But they've become accurate enough that forensic scientists have started exploring DNA-based eye color prediction as an investigative tool in certain criminal cases, estimating a suspect's likely eye color directly from a DNA sample left at a crime scene, long before any eyewitness ever gets involved. And because plenty of unreliable claims circulate online about green eyes and disease risk, what can be said with real confidence is rooted in basic biology rather than speculation. Lower melanin levels in the iris generally correspond to less protection against intense ultraviolet light exposure, which is why people with lighter eye colors are often advised to take extra precautions in strong sunlight, such as wearing quality sunglasses with proper UV protection. Beyond that foundational point, many of the more specific statistical claims floating around online, exact percentage risk reductions for particular conditions, oddly specific country-by-country breakdowns, precise ratios tied to gender, should be treated with real skepticism unless they can be traced back to a genuinely peer-reviewed source. A significant amount of eye color content circulating today comes from low-quality content farms, generating exaggerated or entirely fabricated statistics, designed purely to attract clicks, not to accurately inform anyone. What does hold up under real scientific scrutiny is the core genetic story itself, the OCA2 and HERC2 gene interaction, the Rayleigh scattering effect responsible for both blue and green hues, the polygenic nature of eye color as a trait shaped by well over 100 different genes working in concert, the evidence of positive selection acting on the alleles responsible for lighter eye colors, rather than pure random genetic drift, and the striking rarity of green eyes globally, sitting at around 2% of the world's population, making it statistically less common than natural red hair, less common than being left-handed, and less common than almost any other visible human trait you could name. So the next time you happen to notice someone with green eyes, whether it's a stranger passing by on the street, a character in a film, or maybe even your own reflection staring back at you in the mirror, you're looking at something genuinely remarkable. Not just a striking or unusual eye color, but a rare surviving thread of a genetic mutation that likely emerged from a single common ancestor somewhere near the Black Sea, thousands of years ago. At a moment in human history when every single person on the planet still had dark brown eyes. Somehow, against enormous statistical odds, that fragile genetic thread survived, spread quietly across generations and continents, and made its way all the way down to right now, to this exact moment, carried in the eyes of roughly 2 out of every 100 people alive on Earth today. There's one final piece of this puzzle that puts everything into perspective, and it has to do with just how young this trait really is on an evolutionary timescale. Humans, in something close to our modern anatomical form, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Against that backdrop, a mutation that emerged somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago is almost absurdly recent. A genetic blink of an eye in the grand timeline of our species. Most traits we consider deeply fundamental to human variation, skin tone gradients, basic facial structure, general body proportion, trace back tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, shaped slowly across an immense stretch of time. Green and blue eyes, by comparison, are practically brand new, arriving after agriculture, after the earliest cities, potentially even after the earliest written language systems began to emerge in other parts of the world. That timeline alone tells you something remarkable about how quickly a single genetic accident can spread and take hold under the right circumstances, given enough generations, and, apparently, enough of an evolutionary nudge to keep it moving forward instead of fading away. That's the real story behind green eyes. Not witchcraft, not magic, not some hidden supernatural bloodline passed down through folklore. Something arguably even more remarkable than any myth could offer. A rare, traceable genetic accident, born from a single ancient mutation, shaped by evolutionary pressures, scientists are still actively working to fully understand, and preserved against staggering odds all the way into the present day. If you happen to have green eyes yourself, you are quite literally carrying a rare piece of deep human history within your own body, written directly into your DNA, visible to anyone who simply takes the time to look you in the eye. 2% of the entire human species, carrying a mutation that began with one person, thousands of years ago, and never stopped traveling forward.